Hello, my name's Julian Edgar and I'm the author of this book, Vehicle Aerodynamics, Testing, Modification and Development, and it's aimed at people with road cars, amateur racing cars and also those developing alternative transport. What I want to do in today's video is talk about measuring aerodynamic lift and downforce using laser ride height sensors. In a previous video, I used suspension height sensors, potentiometers that actually attach to the suspension, but now we're going to use a laser ride height sensor instead. So firstly, what's all this about lift and downforce and measuring heights? What's it all about? Well, most cars develop lift, most road cars, basically all road cars develop lift. And they do so because of the curve over their upper surfaces that the airflow wraps around. If we have a look at this shot taken in the Mercedes wind tunnel, you can see the smoke stream show those curves going over the upper surfaces. And when you have flow wrapping around, going over and wrapping around curves, it develops lift. And so to counteract that, we would have to be developing downforce under the car to try and pull the car back down, or try and increase pressures on the top surfaces with a rear spoiler and things of that sort. But in the real world, most of those are quite ineffective compared with the lift forces. And so you do get a lot of body lift. Now, what that does is it actually lifts the bodywork up on the springs. The ride height actually gets higher. If you're saying, well, I've got a racing car and it develops downforce, well, in that case, the bodywork will get pushed down on the springs. The ride height will get lower. Either way, if we can measure the distance from the body to the ground, if that gets bigger, it's probably indicative of lift, and if that gets smaller, it's probably indicative of downforce. And I say probably because there's something else happening as well, and that's tyres change in diameter as you go faster. I'll cover that in more detail in a moment. So I mentioned earlier using suspension ride height sensors. I cover that in another video. It's a really easy way of doing it. You attach a sensor. These are potentiometer sensors, pot sensors. You attach it to the suspension and the bodywork. And as the bodywork rises and the springs get longer, these sensors actually show that change in ride height. But the trouble with these sensors is they're quite fiddly to fit. You've got to do a good job. There can be no slop in the linkages. The brackets have to be rigid. The mounting point for the sensor has to be rigid, and so on. And so what if you've got a car only for a short time, or it's not your car, and you want to measure what's going on? You can't really use these sensors because they are really too much of a drama to install in that situation. If it's your own car and you're using it every day, then certainly these sensors are no problems, but they can be problematic in certain circumstances. So what's a replacement? What's an alternative? An alternative is to use a laser sensor that looks at the ground and has a readout that tells you how far the sensor is away from the ground, how far it is above the ground. And here is an example of a laser ride height sensor. I have made this bracket that suction caps to the side of the car, a very good quality suction cap, as you could imagine. And I've also made it so it's adjustable for height, because typically you want the sensor only about that far above the ground. And it's also adjustable for angle, because the side of the car is not vertical, it's tilted. You want to be able to adjust it so that the sensor's head remains parallel to the ground. So that all sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? Laser sensor pointing at the ground tells you how far above the ground you are. That's the end of the story, eh? Well, not quite. Firstly, laser ride height sensors of the quality we need in this application are expensive. It's the most expensive single instrument or tool I cover in my book. You can look up their price for yourself, but it's vastly more expensive than using a ride height sensor that fits on the suspension or something like that. There are lots of cheap laser ride height sensors around. They do not have the resolution. You want to be able to measure to tenths of a millimeter. They typically and often do not work with a moving ground surface. A lot of the industrial sensors that you can buy rebadged as motorsport sensors are not designed to work with a moving surface. And many of them, often used in drag racing at the front of the car to tell when you are doing a wheel stand, when the wheels are coming off the ground and so cut power to the engine ECU or cut the output of the ECU. they're not good enough in this application. So the major disadvantage is that these sensors are expensive if they are of sufficient quality. And you might be thinking, oh, what about an ultrasonic sensor? They're as cheap as dirt. Oh, yes, I tried them. What about other sensors? I tried lots, and none of them had the resolution or the quality that was needed. So this was the only sensor that I could find that was even remotely within budget that would actually do it, and it's a darn good sensor. You pay a lot, but you get a very, very good sensor as well. However, the sensor output still needs a smoothing circuit, just as we saw with the suspension ride height sensors, because of course, as you're driving along, the car is going up and down on the suspension, and this sensor is so accurate, you can even tell the grain of the bitumen road. You know, the bitumen road's not dead flat, is it? And if it's varying by a few millimetres, or even a millimetre, this sensor will have an output that's bouncing around by that much, even if the suspension were not moving. So you need an output smoothing circuit. It's again a very simple circuit. In this case, it's only 3 components plus a multimeter. You don't need to feed the sensor a regulated supply voltage. It will take 12 volts quite happily from a cigarette lighter, and it's got very good internal regulation. So even if that voltage varies a bit with alternator speed or other engine loads or electrical loads, the sensor still holds a proper output. So it needs a smoothing circuit, but doesn't need a special power supply. So you've got the sensor, you've got it stuck to the side of your car really securely because you do not want it to fall off. It's looking at the road from a distance of 100, 120 millimetres. You've got the smoothing circuit in place so you can read the output of the sensor in volts. And in fact, configured in this way with that sensor, 1.37 volts as shown on the multimeter is actually 137 millimetres. So it's very, very easy to interpret even as you're driving along. What next? Well, here's an example. Measuring the change in rear ride height with the added roof spoiler on a Nissan Nismo Note, and you can see that the sensor is not directly over the rear axle line. Obviously it would be too far away from the road if I were to put it there, but it's close enough. You can still see what's happening with rear axle lift or downforce. But this brings us to a really important point. We said the sensor is expensive, but the other big disadvantage is when it is mounted as shown here, and there's really no alternative, you are also measuring tyre growth. So as you get faster, the tyre grows in diameter, so even if there were no aerodynamic lift or downforce, your ride height would still increase. So how do you differentiate tyre growth from aerodynamic body height changes? Well, really the only way of doing it is to do a test like this at 100 kilometres an hour, or whatever speed you designate, on a certain bit of road or track, with the rear spoiler in place, read the ride height average, and then do exactly that same test again with the spoiler off, with the aerodynamic appendage removed. So you can then see if there's a difference in the ride height with and without the spoiler. It is due only to the difference in with or without the spoiler, because the tyre growth will be the same in both circumstances. So you can't really use the laser sensor to tell whether you're getting overall lift or downforce, not unless you get a lot, of course. If you get massive amount of downforce, then obviously the ride height will decrease even with the tyre growth. But it's really good for A-B comparisons. What's the ride height with this aerodynamic appendage in place? What's the ride height without it in place at the same speed on the same stretch of bitumen? Now, if you've got an active aerodynamic device, a wing that rises or something of that sort, or changes in angle, then of course you can do that as you drive along, because you drive along at a certain speed, change the active aerodynamics, and then see what happens to ride height. So while a laser ride height sensor sounds really trick and really exciting, and you can do tricky things with it, definitely, it is expensive and it's best for A-B comparisons rather than overall downforce or lift. So here's an example of what I did, exactly what I've just described. I put the rear spoiler up on my Porsche Cayman. It normally rises at 120 kilometres an hour, but you've got a centre console button, so you can put it up or down as you wish at speeds at less than that. And I measured the change in ride height with the rear spoiler deployed versus the same speed with the rear spoiler not deployed. Now, I'm not going to give away all the secrets of my book, but that was a very interesting test. In fact, that rear spoiler is an extremely interesting device, covered in quite some detail in my book, but we could certainly see the difference in ride height with and without the spoiler raised. And before I look at the text down the bottom, my son's BMW, I borrowed it from him one day and put a couple of blocks of wood under the trunk lid so that the trunk lid was lifted like that, as if it had a big spoiler added. And there was a distinct, easily measurable change in ride height at the back of the car, even at 100 kilometres an hour with and without the spoiler up. So laser ride height sensing to determine aerodynamic lift and downforce. It's best to do just A-B comparisons at the same speed on the same road, so with and without the aerodynamic change that you're testing. It's a lot more expensive than using a suspension ride height sensor. It's a lot more expensive than even having 4 ride height sensors, one on every corner of your car. But it's quick and easy to fit to different cars. With that suction cap arrangement, putting it on, feeding the wire through the cabin, plugging in 12-volt power, takes just minutes, whereas fitting a ride height sensor to the suspension will typically take hours, 2, 3, 4 hours to do a good job. So the book's called Vehicle Aerodynamics, Testing, Modification and Development. It's available from Amazon in your country now. In the book, I cover 3 different techniques for measuring aerodynamic lift and downforce: the suspension ride height sensors, the laser sensor, and also looking at the trailing vortices behind the car, because their direction of rotation on certain car shapes will tell you whether that shape is developing lift or downforce. It's a big book. It's 500 pages, has over 800 images, photos, graphs, diagrams, all in full color. And so because of that, it's not a cheap book, but I think this book gives you real information that you can immediately apply and be confident in applying in the development or modification of the aerodynamics of your road car, your race car, or any vehicle you are developing from scratch. Thank you.